But yeah, welcome everybody. Excited to kick off day 2 here, and assuming you all can see my screen. A little bit about me. So my background's in econometrics and math. So I run a company called ProfitWell, and I'll explain a little bit of what we do in a second. But I started my career, I worked in U.S. intelligence, and then I worked at Google, basically building value models, which are just a jargony word for taking a bunch of data, applying some algorithms to it for some sort of outcome. So when I was at NSA, basically using data to find bad guys and gals. When I was at Google, like using very similar models, but different data to basically go and find money. So it's just kind of an interesting career so far. And then about 7.5 years ago, started this company called ProfitWell. We're about 65 folks. We're bootstrapped out of Boston, Rosario, Argentina, and then Salt Lake City. And we focus on this whole world of subscription and revenue operations. And what we mean by that is basically we plug into your billing system, and then there's a bunch of different things that we do. And one of our fortes has been around monetization and pricing. So we've helped tons of different companies, anyone from Atlassian and Autodesk all the way to consumer products like Blue Bottle Coffee or Lyft, basically get their monetization right. And in the spirit of, kind of helping all of you, what I really want to do with the next, kind of 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions, is give you a framework for understanding and optimizing monetization within your business. And the big reason for this is because, as you'll find out when we look at some data here, it's one of those levers in terms of growth that, especially performance marketing, is so focused on acquisition. But if we focus a little bit more on pricing, what ends up happening is we can actually make much, much bigger gains with all that momentum that you're bringing through acquisition. And so we're going to jump into this. We're going to jump around a lot. We're going to have a lot of data, so everyone's going to get the slides here. But with that, let's jump in. Already gave a little bit of background on me. In terms of the company, there's one product I kind of want to go a little bit deeper on, just because it's going to give some context to the data that we have. So one of our core products is a freemium product, which we can talk about in the Q&A a little bit more if you're interested. In terms of how freemium works within the market, but we have this product called ProfitWell Metrics. So it plugs into your billing system, Stripe, Zora, Braintree, whatever you're using, and then gives you free access to all of your subscription financial metrics. And the reason that we think this is pretty cool is because we give this away for free in order to not only help with our own acquisition, but also because we use that data to basically not only fuel our paid products, but also to basically study and understand what's happening in the market, what works and what doesn't. And at this point, which is kind of cool, is we actually have about 20% of the entire subscription market using one or more of our products. And so there's this huge bevy of data that we've been able to study to understand, what works, what doesn't. And then especially in the context of COVID, which I know everyone's just kind of burnt out in talking about COVID, but I think we have a little bit of a new angle to kind of like ease you into this monetization discussion. What we were able to do, 10, 11 weeks ago, when we were all kind of kicked in the face here with, uncertainty with what was going to happen, we were able to aggregate a lot of this data to understand like what's happening in the actual market by taking these tens of thousands of companies and basically studying them. And so before we get into the big monetization piece, I want to give you some really recent data that we published. It's updated as of yesterday in what we're calling the ProfitWell Index. So what we did here is basically what I already said, which was we took all of the companies that are on ProfitWell, put them all together, cleaned them, took out the outliers, all those types of things. And we're basically left with about 15,000 companies. And then what we looked at was how is their revenue trending on a daily basis? So how is growth trending on a daily basis? And then we broke that data down into how is new revenue trending on a daily basis and how is churned or canceled revenue trending on a daily basis. And this was important because, at least for us, even selfishly, like trying to figure out how should we make decisions? Is the market, going out of control? Should we listen to the people who are telling us this is the end of the world? Or should we, listen to some of the folks who are saying, hey, this isn't going to be that big of a deal? And the real answer is probably somewhere in between. But just to give you a little bit of context and hopefully ease your nerves a little bit if you're still feeling a little nervous about the next few months, what we found is that, at least for now, the market has bounded back. And what I mean by that is when we look at all subscription companies on ProfitWell, so this is about 15,000 companies here, all of the companies minus the outliers, and we're looking at the overall growth of these companies essentially from January 1st, 2019. And very much like a stock index, we can't show you the tens of billions of dollars on here, but we can at least show you, what the trend looks like. And you'll notice is that right around here is when kind of the lockdowns and work from home really started started to kick into play, all of a sudden we saw a bunch of cancellations and as well as a nice little like slowing to the actual market. And then all of a sudden we've kind of picked back up and we're actually back on top of where we once were. Now, what's kind of fascinating is when you break this data down, what you find is that e-commerce and media companies, so traditional D2C here, they never went down. So this is what the same data or the same timeline looks like, but strictly for the e-commerce, at least subscription e-commerce and subscription media companies. Basically, there's a lot of people who went from, hey, I need to go to the store to purchase this to, hey, I'm going to get my subscription toilet paper, or I'm going to get my utilities or my food or these different things through a particular subscription. And you saw this, as a lot of folks in e-commerce and retail found, this massive acceleration from about 18% to I think about 30% of all retail products or products being bought in e-commerce setting. For some of you who work in a little bit more of the B2B environment, business to business, what was really kind of fascinating is B2B didn't see a downturn or necessarily an upswing. It saw a really good flattening. And, as a B2B company ourselves, what we found is this is mainly because a lot of companies kind of just stopped and waited. And then a lot of B2B companies also have annual contracts. So they were kind of protected from what happened with COVID. And when we dig a little bit deeper here, looking at new revenue as well as lost revenue, what you'll see here is that B2B new revenues actually accelerated. So everyone thought, oh, people are going to stop buying. And that's what's historically happened in past recessions or past depressions. But what was really kind of fascinating is new accelerated. So what you're looking at, and this is a little bit of a different view, this top line here is essentially new revenue or upgrade revenue, so expansion revenue. And then this bottom line here is essentially what you're looking at is downgrades or churn. And you'll notice with B2B here is that there's this nice little seasonality where the first of the month, there's these little bumps. And you'll notice is that basically this new was actually accelerating, even more so than January and February, which is where a lot of like border deals, with the holidays end up closing. But churn obviously tells a different story here on the bottom, where you did see a massive number of cancellations of products, but that's kind of bounced back to, somewhat normal levels, if not good levels, particularly at this point. Now, D2C, media as well as e-commerce, it was just insane. In terms of new revenue, that's where most of that growth is really coming from. And you'll notice the churn on the bottom here is delayed a little bit. And this is kind of natural. I think most e-commerce companies, especially in the subscription game, and even subscription media, they're just terrible at retention. I know that's a gross generalization, but tend to be what we find because they're so focused again on acquisition, and they're really good at acquisition because it's super competitive. But then the rest of kind of like repeat purchases as well as like subscription retention is just not so good. So this churn isn't necessarily, to me, something that's alarming. It's more, oh, this is just the churn that's coming from, the new customers who aren't staying on because the retention practices these firms have isn't really that good. And so, what do we take from all of this? Well, to me, as someone, who studies this types of data, there's a reason that economists only make predictions in the past, right? They don't really like to make predictions in the future because it gets murky. And especially when you have excuse me, using the buzzword, such an unprecedented event, it's one of those things that, gets super tough. But I will say is that when you study every recession or, even the Great Depression, there's typically, two reasons why these things happen. One is because there's a liquidity crisis, we can't get financing or cash, and that's like 2008. Or there's a movement of money, like consumer sentiment kind of goes out of control, which is kind of what happened in 1929 or in 1987 when everyone just kind of hoarded or started to hoard their cash. You had runs on banks and things like that. That didn't happen here. We had a global pandemic, which is like a third reason here. And so what's kind of fascinating is even though this is different, there's never been like a recession or a downturn or a blip within growth that wasn't followed by certain aftershocks. And we've kind of seen this a little bit in the market. Market's hard to kind of gauge just because the market seems to be detached from some of the economic indicators. But what I look at this as an operator, and I feel like you should look at as an operator, is holding on to this mantra of, whoever holds on to the most customers at the end of this is going to end up winning. And this is why I think that, this is a really good time to get aggressive. This is a really good time to kind of basically take some of those fundamentals that you haven't implemented and make sure that you implement them. Not only on kind of the repeat purchase or retention side, but also things like monetization where, you might not necessarily be raising prices or anything like that right now, although some people should be doing that. But there's a lot of things that you can do to make sure you're kind of shoring up and getting as many of those users or those customers so that you have this nice pool of people that at the end of this, you can end up being able to not only monetize even further, but also growing your business even further. And so we're not going to be able to touch on all of that, although we can definitely address some of these things in Q&A. But what I do want to address and do want to walk through is monetization, which is obviously the main subject of this talk. And in order to do that, I first want to set the stage. And I think this is really important because when people think of pricing or monetization, the first thing they think of is, raising prices, right? And that's literally one of the smallest levers that you have when it comes to monetization. So if we take a step back and we think about what are we trying to do with monetization? So no matter what your business is, whether you're selling a retail product, you're a nonprofit, you're a SaaS company or a subscription company, it doesn't really matter what you're doing. What you've done is you've created some sort of value. And because we don't trade like goats for wheat and, we're not in a barter economy anymore, what you're then doing is you're saying this product or this value that I've created, it's worth this much, in dollars, pounds, euros, whatever it is. And in this manner, it's this exchange rate. And so what I want you to think about with monetization and pricing is that it's the exchange rate on the value that you're creating. And that means when we kind of go a little bit deeper here, when we look at our business, and again, it doesn't matter if you're a subscription business, if you're a one-time business, it doesn't matter what it is, everything that you're doing from your marketing and your sales all the way down to your product and your operations team is used to either drive someone to a point of conversion or justify the price or the product that you're offering them. And some of those things are a little bit more disconnected than others. But when we start to think about this way, then we start to realize that from a monetization perspective, we can change who we target. The nature of going up market or down market or changing up the verticals who we're targeting. We can obviously change up the product, not only in terms of which features are in which plans or what features we're accentuating in terms of our positioning, but also things like, hey, let's make this particular feature an add-on, or let's make this particular feature something that's included in every single plan, or let's break this off and make it into a freemium tier. And then obviously there's also the price. And so when I think about, how to look at a metric, if we go a little bit deeper here, what you should be really focusing on is ARPU, or you might measure it as ACV, might measure it as average order value, could measure it as lifetime value. Basically, how much revenue are you procuring or you getting on a per customer basis? And then you want that number to be continually going up over time. And if you start to focus on that particular metric, you start to realize there's a bunch of different things that can detract from the revenue per user or add to that revenue per user. And some of these are easier than others. In the easy world, things like the value metric. So if you're in a software company or even some services, depending on what you're selling, it might be how much you offer for the price. So you might offer 100 visits a month for $100. Then instead, you might offer for $100 only 80 visits. So you can make those adjustments pretty easily. And most of your existing customers don't feel it, especially if you only offer it up to your new customers. You can do a price increase. This is actually relatively easy. I know it feels hard because we get emotional about price increases, but it is something that's pretty straightforward. Add-on strategy. I think add-ons, no matter if you're e-commerce brand, media brand, SaaS company, B2B company, it's one of the most underutilized, things for monetization strategy, especially since it's relatively easy now to add features or add products or these types of things. And then there's harder things, customer proportions. It used to be going up market or going down market was actually a pretty easy thing to do because there just wasn't as much competition out there. Today, it's actually really, really hard because there's so many things competing for everyone's attention at this point. And then feature upgrades, these types of things like, hey, how to get someone to upgrade to more. And so ultimately that number of amount of revenue per customer is the game. And a lot of us aren't really playing it. Just to give you some data there, the average amount of time it takes, a subscription company at least, and we do have this data for non-subscription companies and it's pretty much the same. But the average amount of time it typically takes a company to adjust their pricing, not just raise their pricing, but do anything related to like actual monetization, it's about 3 years. And if you think about that, your main levers in your business are your acquisition, your monetization, and then your retention or repeat purchase rate. If you're only adjusting this one lever every 3 years, that's a lot of missed opportunity. And the one thing that we found is that the more you change your pricing, and again, this is not price increases, this is anything related to your pricing, changing your discounting strategy, changing your bundling strategy, all of these different things. The more you change those things and more the optimize, your monetization, the more gains you'll make on this metric of the revenue per customer. And so, what you'll see here, and this is some actual data from about 3,000 companies, is that essentially this top line that you're looking at, these are folks who are adjusting their pricing every single quarter. Again, not raising their price every quarter, but making some adjustment. Next line down is folks who do it every 6 months. Next line down is yearly. And then the bottom line there are basically the common company who's not adjusting things, all but every 3 years. And you're looking at ARPU growth. And so this is a really, really critical fact to kind of look into, because again, when you make adjustments or when you focus on something, you tend to focus and change it in the right direction. Now, in terms of like why this is so important right now, like why is monetization something you should focus on? Well, the simple fact is we're living on another planet. If you were in the game, 15, 20 years ago, there are actually some very large barriers to starting a company, not necessarily from a governmental standpoint, but just from either figuring out logistics and fulfillment, in Southeast Asia or in US manufacturers, or, just like getting servers, if you were a software company or even a media company that you had to store in some closet within your office because we didn't necessarily have the proliferation of the cloud. And what that caused is there's just a ton of different products out there who have not only increased, the competition, but have also made it so that acquisition costs are up probably about 60, 70% over the past 5 years in almost every single channel. And I didn't share the data on that in here, but if you want that data, I'm more than happy to share it afterwards. And in addition to that, because there's so many more products out there, software and even e-commerce products, retail products, they've lost a little bit of their magic because we just have so many options now. Now, what this environment has created is that acquiring customers in terms of growth is now table stakes. If you were starting a business 15 years ago and you're able to get over these barriers to entry that existed, you actually could create an amazing business because every single quarter we had a brand new marketing channel basically opening up. Google AdWords for a penny a click, then remarketing, then Yahoo Display Network, then Google Display Network, and so on and so forth. But now we haven't had a new major marketing channel since probably around 2015 when Snapchat opened up. TikTok's a little bit TBD, but it's one of those things. This is why we're all reinventing these channels. But what it has caused, it's caused the impact of acquisition on your growth to actually go down. And to kind of display this, we put together a model where we basically looked at if we adjusted those main levers in your business, acquisition, monetization, and retention, and we moved them up by the same relative amount, what would be the impact on revenue? So if we increase your leads or your conversion volume by 1%, what you can expect, on average, at least for this data set, is about 2 to 3% boost in your actual revenue. Now, if we increase your ARPU, your ACV, your revenue per customer by that 1%, or we improve your retention or, in some cases, repeat purchase rate by about 1%, you're actually going to see about a 4 to 8x impact on your revenue compared to acquisition. Now, this isn't to say, hey, stop spending 50% of your budget and people power on acquiring customers and the marketing side. Like, that's not going to change. But it is to say that you need to get better at that just to survive. And where a lot of growth is going to end up coming from is making sure that you're monetizing and retaining or getting those repeat purchase rates up. And ultimately, if we really evaluate how much time and effort we actually spend over on these two particular growth levers, we'll probably be a little bit embarrassed because we all know like, hey, this stuff's important, but it's one of those things where it always gets distracted. And so you're never going to spend as much time and effort as, acquiring customers, and you shouldn't in terms of a good business. But if you do a little bit of extra time, a little bit of extra effort to get those 1% gains on monetization and retention, which definitely are harder than those 1% gains on acquisition, it allows you to actually have a really, really good balanced growth business, which is ultimately what we're going for is, something that grows really, really quickly and is taking advantage of these major growth levers. And so the rest of the time here, I want to spend just talking a little bit about, okay, now that you're on board that monetization is important, like where do you start? What should you focus on? Because there's a lot of different things that you can use as an entry point. And what I typically find when I'm teaching about monetization and pricing is that most folks want tactics. So I get a lot of questions on, should I end my prices in 9s versus 0s? What should my discounting strategy be? How do you actually raise prices? These types of things. And there are answers, data-driven answers to all of those questions. But I think what ends up happening is we focus a little bit on the last kind of 5% optimizations and not enough on like truly understanding what is the value of our products and ultimately who is our target customer. And so what I want to do is just really briefly, and we can do the tactical stuff in the Q&A here. I want to go a little bit of give you some tools to understand kind of the strategic element when it comes to pricing. Because what that really comes down to is measuring value. And there's this whole concept of value-based pricing, which you probably read like a Forbes article at some point that was like, hey, you should price based on value. And then they never really explained what the hell value-based pricing was and how do you price based on value. But the basic concept is that you're pricing based on collecting data from your target customers or target segments, and then based on that data or that signal that you have, pricing based on that information rather than things like your costs or your competitors. Or at the very least, to kind of state this a little bit more kind of on a 201 level, you're prioritizing value data, and secondary and tertiary data are things like costs and competitors. And the reason for this is that most of you crave data when it comes to monetization because you're like, I don't know what to do. Like, what's our costs? What are our competitors, right? That's data that's a little bit more concretely you're able to get a hold of, at least given, some of the things that you've done in the past. The problem is that for most of our products, costs are it's not that they're irrelevant. It's that they're too focused on you. And what I mean by that is that your customers don't care about your costs. They care about their costs. And oftentimes, a lot of the products that we're offering, our costs are much, much lower compared to the actual value that we're providing, if we're actually able to measure where that value is, which we're going to talk about in a second. Now, similarly, on the competitor side, you're assuming that your competitors have done their homework when it comes to pricing when you're copying them. And I almost guarantee you your competitors have not done their homework. In addition to that, you are basically saying that your competitors are selling the exact same product to the exact same type of customer, which may be true, but as founders and operators, we over-index on that competitive behavior, when in reality, we're probably facing, well, not in all industries, but in a lot of industries, we're facing just the non-knowledge of our product versus actually the competitor being the one to lose deals. And so sometimes, you are in really competitive markets, so I don't want to like downplay that data, but it is one of those things that you should be collecting this value data first and then looking at your costs and competitors. So if I find out that the value data tells us, oh, the willingness to pay is $100 and my costs are, $150 and my competitors are $80, that doesn't mean like, cool, let's price it at 75, which, is what some of you do. And it doesn't mean, oh, let's price it at 175, which is also some of the things that you do. It means what you should figure out is, okay, we're probably not going after the right customer. We're probably, need to get our costs in check. And maybe we need to consider like, are we actually competing against these individuals if there's this big of a differential, and then figure out where to go from there. Now, the why is this important? And I promise we're going to get into how to actually collect this information, but just a little bit of a sidebar. I want to show you how different our conceptions of value are versus what our customers think. And I think we have gotten pretty bad at understanding like how valuable our products are or not so valuable. And to kind of reveal this, I'm kind of dipping here, where I'm going to show you a little bit of a model that we've kind of come up with to actually look at value for like any product. And for those of you who might be scared by the word of like model or something like that, don't worry. It's like a nice little 2x2 here. But if you think about any product, and it doesn't matter if it's a cup of coffee here, or if it's a computer or a piece of software, it doesn't really matter what it is. There's two axes of value with a product. The first axis is like the attributes or the features. So for a cup of coffee, it's things like taste, country of origin, temperature, these types of things, right? And then the second axis is the actual, like, how much are people willing to pay? Now, what I can do is I can use some methodologies we're going to talk about in a second, and I can survey this room. I can survey the city of Salt Lake here. I can survey a subset of people throughout the United States or the world. And I can find out that when it comes to the features or the attributes of a cup of coffee, most of you care about taste. Not all of you, that's not your number one, but most in the aggregate or for the segment care about taste. You're pretty indifferent about temperature. And then country of origin, it's basically the least valued compared to the other features. It doesn't mean that it's not important. It just means when push comes to shove, when compared to different features, basically it's the least important. Now, if I cross-reference this data essentially with willingness to pay information, I might find out that those of you who care about taste, the number one thing, you're willing to pay about 25% more. Those of you who care about temperature, it's your number one thing. There's not a lot of you. You're willing to pay about 20% less. And those of you who care about country of origin, the hipsters in the room, there's very few of you, but those of you who exist are willing to pay about 35% more. Now, what's cool about this, and I'm going to show you how to actually collect this data in a second, is that if I find a feature or an attribute of my product that has high value relative to the other features, and those people who care about it are willing to pay more, that's a differentiable feature, or that's the luxury line for your retail product. Now, if I find something that's low value relative to the other features and also high willingness to pay, that's an add-on. These are the things that, hey, they're the things that you show in your cart to like add to your cart, or the things that you go out to your subscription customers and say, hey, do you want to buy this as well? If I find something that's high value and low willingness to pay, that's typically a core feature. And then if I find something that's low value and low willingness to pay, it's trash. And so what's really kind of fascinating is you will have to build trash depending on your product. So if I was building a software company that was targeting, ride sharing, if I didn't have a mobile app, I'm not even in the game. So that's going to show up in trash because it's just such table stakes that it doesn't make sense, not to have it. Now, it's kind of fascinating as we went out to, and this is strictly in the software space, but we've done some studies similarly in not other spaces, but we went out to about 1,300 product leaders. So these are the people who are deciding what to build for a software company. And we asked them for their last N features, and we made sure that they understood what they were looking at. Hey, where do you think you fall on this spectrum? And they basically said for about 5,000 features that they were building a ton of value and things that were super, super valuable for them. We then went out to about 1.2 million different users of these products. And we asked them using basically some of the methodologies we're about to show you, but our versions that are on steroids with our software. And we basically asked, well, like, where was true willingness to pay? Where was true relative value? And this is what they told us. And so the reason I wanted to show you this is because a lot of times we think this is what we're building, and our customers think this is what we're building. And it's not necessarily our fault. I mean, it is ultimately our fault. But the reason that this is such a kind of disconnect is because when we were building products or building businesses 10, 15 years ago with that lack of competition, roadmaps and things that we offered and fulfillment and these types of things, they weren't necessarily hard because, you kind of, well, if I'm building a CRM, well, I kind of know the features, and we're building so slowly because it's hard to build things that we can kind of like, understand what's going on. But now, because there's been such proliferation of different business tools, we're all kind of moving at a similar pace. It's one of those things where this is why it's so much more important to understand the customer, because that disconnect is costing us time and money when we don't understand what's valuable, and we end up building, this boondoggle that not enough people are actually going to use. And so when we think back to the core tenets of monetization, if you don't know who this customer is, you don't know who they value, you don't know where their willingness to pay is, it's really hard to build an efficient funnel, let alone a business that's actually going to grow consistently. And so we need to measure value. And the biggest thing I talk about is stop building, stop buying ads, stop guessing and checking. These are your paths of least resistance. I have them too. These are just the paths that, that's easier than like going out and doing research and talking to customers. And if you take away one thing from this, like, please, for the love of God, go talk to your customers. Put a number on the board. It can be informal conversations. You can do a survey, something like that, but just like start small and just start answering some questions or start getting some information from them, because what ends up happening is those answers beget more questions, which then beget more answers, and it gets you some really, really good progress on pinpointing where you're going to go. And a lot of people don't do this because they think, I'm never going to get a perfect answer. You're never going to get a perfect answer, but that's not the point. The point is to understand and kind of, using some jargon here, like vectoring to a point where you understand who is that segment that you're going after, what do they value, what are they looking for, to not only help your sales team, your marketing team, but also help ultimately your, product or your retention teams keep those customers into the long term and charge them at the right price. So how do we do that? The biggest thing to do is start with your buyer personas. Now, this can be profiles, jobs to be done. I don't really care what format you use. Just make sure there's something in your business that you can point to that says, hey, here's who we sell to. And it's one of those things where even if you just do this step and don't collect any data, it's actually super helpful to be like, hey, we're selling to these folks and we're not selling to these folks, or we're selling to these two people or these two profiles of people. And this is what they look like. This is what they value. This is what they don't value. We think this is their lifetime value. and hopefully you can actually measure that. We think their willingness to pay is here. We think their customer acquisition cost is here. And then what the game becomes is either just keep that and then use that as a central point to argue about, because then what happens is you'll reach a stalemate in some argument and they'll be like, cool, we have to go collect the data and do some research. But ultimately what you're trying to do is then validate or invalidate these different pieces. And you're going to have to use some judgment calls. Like sometimes you just want to get a baseline understanding of these customers, and that's the first type of research you're going to do. Other times you have a really specific question, because before you build this big thing for your enterprise customers, you want to make sure that there's some level of value. And this isn't the only data you're going to use, but it is one of those things that allows you to like hedge those decisions. Now, to validate and invalidate, we're going to use essentially a bastardized version of the scientific method, which is basically we're going to go out to those types of customers or prospects. We're going to collect some data from them, put them through some basic statistical models. You can make them much more complicated if you want. That's what we've done with our software, but the basic ones at least get you part of the way there. And then that's going to allow us to quantify our buyers and basically validate or invalidate those folks, and then help us earn our paycheck and make some decisions when it comes to our pricing strategy. Now, the way that you're going to collect this data is through surveys. And I know what anyone listening to this or watching this later is thinking, like, everyone hates surveys, right? The problem is we hate surveys because we are terrible as operators at sending surveys. The last survey I received, and I've used this example for quite a while now, and the name changes, but it's always basically the same. I think last time the survey I received was actually from, I believe, Marketo, or HubSpot customers. So I don't know why they were sending us a survey, but Marketo was telling us, they sent me a survey that was 45 questions long. I think it was like a little over 45. And the first question, even though it was emailed to me, the first question was, what's my email address, right? So that's a sign of like not the survey's fault. That's a sign of the operator's fault. And it's understandable because people, they put together these giant surveys because they're like, oh, I'm going to get all this information. But we've sent about 30 million of these. I think it's more at this point in terms of like our pricing software. That's what feeds our algorithms, is the survey data. If you're sending a survey that's non-compensated, that's over 30 seconds to probably, honestly, probably like a minute and a half, you probably just shouldn't send it. And this means you have to chunk down the information gathering you're doing. Now, you can compensate someone and get probably up to about 15 minutes of their time before you get fatigue in the actual answers that they're giving. But it's one of those things that surveys are actually a phenomenal tool. We've studied them a lot. I can send you some information, some data that we've collected on them. But the big thing here is like, don't hate the survey, hate the sender, because they're normally the people who are messing up actual data collection. Now, some other questions I get is who to survey. Well, it's going to depend on what type of work you're doing. You're going to go after maybe prospects and customers. You want to collect data from both of them to basically understand, okay, how does someone who hasn't bought, what's their willingness to pay versus someone who's been with us for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, et cetera. And then sometimes you want to collect from what are called market panelists, where there's these companies that exist where their entire goal is to basically give you access to anyone from a soccer mom or dad in the middle of Kansas, all the way up to a Fortune 500 CIO in the UK. And those cost very different amounts of money, but it allows you to kind of get information quickly. If I was in a consumer product or an SMB product, I could get answers within 4 hours right now using something like AYTM, askyourtargetmarket.com. And that's really, really, helpful to not only compare to that customer or prospect data, but also get information from people who may not have heard of us ever, but they're in our target customer base. And sometimes what happens when you're collecting pricing data, basically you'll have a situation where the highest price will be the people, or willingness to pay will be people who've never heard of you, and your prospects are willing to pay less and your customers are willing to pay much less. And this is normally not because there's a value differential, but it's because you've anchored your current customers too low and your price should actually go up. And this is why it's so important to like actually get some measurement from people who haven't heard of you or aren't using the product, because those are the folks who aren't anchored by your probably just kind of thrown out there pricing that you did originally when you were putting your product together. Now, a couple of methodologies to actually collect data. So this is the X and Y on the X and Y plot. We're going to use a relative preference data. This is very similar, or basically is something called max diff, if anyone was a math or statistics nerd out there. And then we're going to use a price sensitivity meter, which is similar to something called Van Westendorp. Now, you can use many different models in doing this, but the big thing I want to kind of point out is the reason I'm teaching these two is because they're extremely efficient, meaning the amount of work you have to put in to get the data is very low, and you're getting a much, much higher impact. Now, there's things called conjoint and these types of things. You have to put a lot more work, and you get probably a little bit better impact, but it's not that much better than just using some of these basic models. So first up on that x-axis, do they care about taste, country of origin, and the cup of coffee example? The basic thing that we're going to do is, instead of asking like, hey, do you like this feature? What about this feature? Which, really is the questions that we end up asking. We're going to ask folks, of the following, what is the most important and what is the least important? And what this allows us to do is it allows us to point out, when we do some basic math, and you can make it more complicated if you want, we not only figure out rank order, but we also can figure out magnitude. So we can find out, oh, this feature is, this much, more preferred than this other feature. But it also forces a user to actually make a decision, which is ultimately what you're trying to do when you're collecting data. Because while that user, we may want to, sell something individually to them, ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand these segments, right? So when I break this data down on, the size of the company from a revenue perspective, I can start to figure out, oh, as they get bigger, they start to care about this thing more. As they get smaller, they start to care about this thing more. And what that allows me to do is it starts to put together a picture with my personas to actually understand, like, oh, now with one question, when our product leader or a marketer or whomever and I are arguing about, hey, well, we should do this. And I can go, wait a minute, I thought we agreed we're not going to go after Startup Steve. We're going to go after Enterprise Meredith. So why would we care about that thing that is only Startup Steve specific, right? And that's what helps be as like a constitution within your company to make these incremental changes to ultimately keep your focus. Now, on the pricing side, everyone always wants like some magic bullet. Everyone's always interested in like, oh, what is like, how do I figure this out without talking to my customers? Well, there really isn't a good way unless you're in a truly demand or market-based business. And most of us, we think we are, but we're not. If you're in a commodities business, you definitely don't need to talk to anyone. But I think that what we can do is we can take advantage of how people think about value. So psychologists and economists have studied this for a really long time. And what they found is we think about value as a human being on a spectrum. So we know that this computer is worth more than, this cup of coffee, right? Now, if you put me, in a sleep deprivation tank for like 3 days, all of a sudden that value differential might change, where I might value this cup of coffee more than this computer. But the big thing to kind of think about is we don't think about value as a single point. And so we can take advantage of this by basically asking some ranged questions that are a little bit clunkier. They're not as smooth, but it is one of those things that it gets you that rich data and kind of balances that, again, that cost to kind of, the ROI of actually asking the question. And so the 4 questions that I'm going to ask, and if I'm asking in person, I might only use 2 of these, are, at what point is this way too expensive that you would never consider purchasing it? At what point is this, getting expensive? At what point is it a good deal? And then oftentimes a really important question, especially for digital goods or software, is at what point is it too cheap that you question the quality of it? And what we typically find, the reason for that question is so important, is that there's some of us, it's actually a lot of us, who just devalue our products so much because we're nervous and we just want to make sure that we get sales. And what ends up happening is we end up kind of, shooting ourselves in the foot, for lack of a better expression, and end up like anchoring our product too far down. Now, again, with some basic math, and you can make this much more complicated if you want, you get output that looks like this. So each of those questions corresponds to one of these lines up here, where over here you have, at what point is it way too expensive? At what point is it a good deal? And then on the left, at what point is it getting expensive? And then on the left, at what point is it a good deal? And what point is it too cheap? And then you get this diamond pattern here in the middle that allows you to figure out, at least for this segment, if I broke this down, like where is the range of acceptable prices? And then this bottom graph here is basically, it's called an elasticity curve. So I can find out if I move my price, at least for this segment, what's going to be the relative gain or loss in the number of sales I'm going to get. And then I mentioned segmentation. It's really important to break this data down, because you'll find out, okay, interesting. So I can actually increase my price up to this volume, and then people want a volume discount. Oftentimes what we find is people will just peg really high and then just all the way come down as volume goes up, which is not necessarily something that you need to do. And when I put this back into my personas, what I can start to discover is, okay, cool, like which segments are actually profitable for me, or which segments are the ones that I should target. And sometimes you find out, which I think is equally as important, which segments are just absolutely terrible, right? We found this out, and not to go too deep into this just for the sake of time, but when we were coming out with our ProfitWell metrics product, we intended to sell it. And what we discovered is that no one wanted to pay for it. And this is where most analytics and BI tools, this is why they go up market. They go towards more enterprise companies, because it's really, really hard to get people to keep paying for an analytics product, because they know there's value there, but the willingness to pay just tends to be really, really low. And so we had a decision of, hey, we just scrap it, or we figure out a different model for our business overall where we can basically give this away for free. And there were some other options there, but those were the main two options. Now I can take this data and I can also apply it to that matrix that we talked about. And that allows me to kind of figure out like, oh, this is where these features are for this particular segment. And you can layer different segments or different personas on this as well. So you can kind of see how things shift, particularly when you do different things. Now, I know that's a lot of information, and there's a lot of like probably holes that I didn't fill here in terms of knowledge gaps. So we wrote a book on this, and I'm more than happy to share with everybody. And the big thing I just want to keep in mind, though, is that these are some tools that you can use to apply to a lot of different monetization pieces. And I think that's a really, really crucial thing to keep in mind, is that there's a lot of things that you can do with these tools. And so what I recommend doing is, if you've never done anything before, start small. You can always do more. And just keep in mind that you should be doing something on a quarterly basis, or if you're not ready for that, at least every 6 months, when it comes to this monetization lever. And hopefully you've realized, and I know we went through a lot of stuff that there might still be those knowledge gaps for, but this isn't something that's extremely difficult. It's one of those things that does take work, and rarely, typically when you collect data, you'll have some things that are just like perfect answers, like, oh my gosh, we absolutely have to do that. But a lot of times it's like, oh, this data here is really interesting, I'm going to combine it with that data. And then ultimately what that's going to allow me to do is make that right data informed decision. But ultimately it's one of those things that, like, this is one of the biggest pieces you have to really understand in order to get to a high growth business, versus just kind of acquiring customers who aren't paying you as much and end up leaving because you're not really getting that value differential properly set up within the business. And with that, I think we got a couple of minutes here for questions. But before we get to that, really briefly, if you want to talk about this stuff, if you're like, hey, I have a question on this, we've probably written something on this. We have a show that's called Pricing Page Teardown that we publish periodically, that, from video, we collect a bunch of data on different brands and things like that, and look at where their pricing isn't as good, or where it could be better, or where it's great in some cases. Feel free to email me at patrick@profitwell.com. Like, more than happy to help. And let's get to some Q&A, if we have any. I might have bored you all to death here. Trying to see the Zoom here. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A pane or into the chat. That's what I can see, at least, when it comes to the Zoom here. All right, Kenwar asks, can you comment on how you evaluate strategic value when you consider a feature, i.e. it isn't about tactical value, but longer term value in that direction? Yeah, this is a great question, because there's going to be some things that are, again, like, just like Kenwar said, like, they're long-term value versus like short-term value. So I think that when we look at doing like a product, we'll do like a product roadmap sprint when it comes to like data collection, where we'll go after our target profiles and personas, and we'll basically collect different information on like what's valuable, what's not. And then the way we filter it is we have, a clear thesis on how we build or how we decide products. And for us, it's, more money, more customers or users. And there's a couple of other pieces, and those are like the principles that we look at. And we try to essentially filter and just make sure that we're not putting everything into one basket every single quarter. So what I mean by that is, it's just our product team, I guess that's the shortest answer to your question, just our product team just making, those decisions, because they're really, really close to the roadmap. And so there might be something that, like, oh, we can squeeze in here, we can squeeze in there, or hey, here's this big thing that we know is going to be important based on the data that we're seeing. It's just not necessarily as important right now. And so we still need to build it because we need to get data and information and things like that. One other thing that we do, and this is a little off the beaten path, is we like to focus on the quickest path to learning as well. So if we have an inkling for like an entire, kind of product line, or an entire like feature that could expand very quickly into lots of different features, what we'll do is we'll do this kind of research, and then also look at the market and kind of determine like, essentially what's an MVP of that feature that we could ship out there, so that we can then collect more information and kind of see how it goes. And that's kind of what we do. And I think that the lesson for everyone there, besides the answer to your question, is there's a lot of different data points that you have to look at when you're making some of these decisions. And I would argue that when you collect this type of data that we talked about, you then have to make a big decision on, like, what kind of company do you want to be? What's your DNA? You might find out that small customers are willing to pay more than you thought, but you're terrible at acquiring them. You're more of an enterprise sales shop. And if that's the case, like, you can ignore that data. It's okay. It's okay to ignore that data and just go after the enterprise if that's what's in your DNA. Ooh, anonymous attendee. This is a good question. Who should lead the price setting practice? Sales, marketing, finance. I have some slides on this. I'm not going to pull them up just for the sake of time, but you should have what's called a pricing committee. And I know committees sound terrible, but honestly, like, the number one barrier to implementing pricing changes is just internal politics. And it's not because the cultures are bad. It's just pricing, because it's so central, everyone's got an opinion, and you're like scared to like aggravate people. There's this confidence gap. So you're like, oh man, I got to talk to John in sales about this, and then Julie in customer success. And like, I don't want to go through that, so it just gets really complicated. So a committee is basically someone made up of leadership from sales, marketing, finance, and product typically. And then based on that, what you end up doing is normally product or marketing or the equivalents within your organization should be in charge. And the reason for this is that sales, it's not that I've met heads of sales who can and are good people to run pricing projects. They're just not necessarily in aggregate aligned from an incentive standpoint to raise prices if it needs to happen, or make some certain changes. But they need to be part of the conversation because they're going to be the ones who are actually like implementing. In addition to that, I think that finance is typically really, really good at Excel engineering models, but their inputs aren't necessarily right because they're not necessarily close to the customer doing research and things like that. And particularly a large organization where there's like a corp dev team or a corporate strategy team in finance, that team can also lead pricing, but they're a little bit more disconnected from again, the Excel engineering of financial projections. And so normally product and marketing are much closer to the customer. And one of those organizations is probably doing some research already on the customer. And so that's where it probably should sit. And then having a deadline on changes and decision makers. I know it sounds super simple and pedantic, but honestly, those are the two things that hold most people back. Good question. Let me see if there's any in the chat here. Alexi, it's Patrick at ProfitWell.com. If I can find the chat here, I'll type it in here. Any other questions? Everflow crew, I'm more than happy to answer your questions as well if you have any. Cool. Well, thanks for having me, everybody. And I think, Sam, you might be taken back over to tell us what's next.